Now, Eritrean troops fighting in Ethiopia's Tigray state systematically killed hundreds of unarmed civilians in the northern city of Axum on the 28th and the 29th of November 2020. An Amnesty International report reveals that troops opened fire in the streets and conducted house-to-house raids in a massacre that may amount to a crime against humanity. Joining us now is Joanne Mariner, Director of Crisis Response at Amnesty International. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Now, your report describes a massacre on the 28th as well as the 29th of November in Axum. How and why did this happen?
It happened after Eritrean and Ethiopian forces took the city of Axum, which had been in the control of Tigrayan forces. And they had been in the city for approximately 10 days and had carried out some atrocities even prior to the massacre. There had been extrajudicial executions of people suspected of supporting or belonging to Tigrayan forces. There had been massive looting. But what sparked the massacre itself was the morning that it took place, there was an attack on a base held by Eritrean troops. So pro-TPLF forces mounted an attack on the base, and they got some support, I mean, mostly sort of moral support from local youth, who were cheering them on or who came along, with sticks and stones. So that attack was successfully repelled. But in retaliation, they just went across the city and really went on the rampage. They deliberately shot civilians in the street, and we have, multiple testimonies of groups of people being killed together. And then they went house to house, and they searched for men. If you were a woman, they left you alone. They didn't kill you. But men, they pulled out and they extrajudicially executed on the spot. So in all, hundreds of civilians were killed. And we also interviewed numerous people who were involved in picking up the bodies in the following days and burying them. And we have accounts of hundreds of people, and we actually have the name of over 241 people who were killed.
Give us a bit of background to this, Joanne. There have been ongoing conflicts between the Ethiopian government as well as forces aligned to TPLF. What is the main objective here? Why do these conflicts actually exist?
Well, I mean, the TPLF obviously was the governing party and was engaged in its own armed conflict with Eritrea over, a very bloody, very, horrific conflict that lasted a long time. So you have long-standing rivalry and, I would say hatred on both sides. But now what you had was the Ethiopian government, I think, deciding to, well, there was apparently a TPLF effort to take over Ethiopian bases within Tigray, but that has led to the Ethiopian government deciding to basically beat the TPLF, and to do so, it seems that they need the assistance of Eritrean forces. So, we have testimonies not just from Axum, but from different cities across the region that there are areas where, in fact, the Eritrean forces are by far the majority or even the only forces holding territory. They're very clearly, despite the denials of both the Eritrean and the Ethiopian government, they're very clearly an active player in this conflict.
Now, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has a huge amount of pressure on him to actually end this conflict. Actually, in 2019, he received a Nobel Peace Prize for the efforts that he's made in ending these conflicts. Clearly, that hasn't worked.
I think the Nobel Committee may be regretful at this point about the Peace Prize, because it was, of course, important and a huge step forward that there's peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia, but there is far from being peace within Ethiopia. There's, obviously horrifically severe repression now in Tigray province, and in other provinces there are reports of serious abuses as well.
Now tell us, after the killings, you mentioned there that people were actually allowed to go into the streets and take the bodies of their loved ones and bury them, with hundreds being buried around St. Mary's of Zion Church. What was that like for the residents of Axum?
Initially, people weren't allowed, and there were actually people who tried to go out and bury bodies and were themselves shot. And apparently they were told by soldiers, we've lost our members, so, you get to suffer too. But then the elders negotiated with the Eritrean forces, and finally it was accepted that they could pick the bodies off the street and bury them. This happened actually during what was normally a large celebration. It's a religious holiday on November 30th, but instead you had mass burials. Instead of celebrating, you had mass sadness, terrible despair, hundreds of people dead, hundreds of people's relatives, brothers and sisters and family members dead. So it was, it is either the worst or one of the very worst atrocities that have happened so far in this conflict. And it was a terrible tragedy for the city.
Tell us more about the findings that you made during this investigation, as well as the type of challenges that you came across.
Well, one of the really obvious challenges is the government has not granted access to human rights organizations to do investigations on the ground. And there was also, from much of the time, there's been a phone and internet cutoff. So we don't have much access to people in Axum. What we did was we went to Eastern Sudan, where you had, quite a large outflow of tens of thousands of Ethiopian refugees, including quite a number from Axum, even though, the trip is really onerous, but we still managed to speak to 41 witnesses during 2 trips to Eastern Sudan, and a number of people who we later spoke to on the ground, especially after, when communications became possible. And then what we did was we also corroborated our witness testimonies, or cross-checked our witness testimonies, with satellite imagery and with digital evidence that we were able to gather. So there have been some videos that have now managed to slip out, and there's satellite imagery showing, for example, the looting, showing the mass graves, showing what looks like evidence of indiscriminate shelling. So, using kind of a range of different methodologies, we were able to come to, I think, very firm conclusions about this massacre.
Now, there have been some reports coming out of both Ethiopia and Eritrea with a denial that Eritrean forces were actually involved in this massacre. Also, even the information minister of Eritrea questioning the report that you have put together, saying that you are biased against Eritrea. What are your comments regarding that?
We just have the evidence is so strong, and it's a mix of witness testimonies, and the witnesses are, interviewed in a way that's meant to test what they say. We interview people individually, we interview them in detail, and we cross-check what they tell us with others, and we cross-check it with satellite imagery, with digital imagery. So I think, it's actually beyond dispute that there are Eritrean forces operating in Ethiopia, and we are absolutely convinced of the fact that this massacre occurred. I think if the government wants to assess the truth more deeply, it should invite international investigators in, whatever investigators it would consider unbiased. We're recommending UN investigators, and give them access to actually, those mass graves can be exhumed. witnesses can be interviewed. It's a large city. There are thousands of people who could be interviewed. So we would welcome a further investigation of these claims.
As we end off, Joanne, what does Amnesty International want to happen now?
I mean, most urgently, we would like this kind of atrocity to stop taking place. And we know we have further testimonies about, smaller scale, but killings in remote villages. The kind of looting that we saw in Axum taking place on a smaller scale across the region. I think the Ethiopian government needs to take steps to rein in Eritrean forces. The perpetrators of this kind of abuse need to be prosecuted, and the first responsibility for that is on the Ethiopian government. And the international community, particularly the African Union and influential states in Africa, need to be putting pressure on both the Eritrean and the Ethiopian government to take steps to stop this kind of horrific violence.
Joanne, thank you very much for your time, as well as that investigative report that was put together by Amnesty International. That's Joanne Mariner, Director of Crisis Response at Amnesty International.